This is Akash Chauhan, and in today's lecture, we will start with Unit First of Advanced Level Program. So, all these topics I have written, what we will cover in this unit. First of all, we will explore about what is Java.NET package, okay, and later we will explore the networking basics, okay. In that, we will cover sockets, we will cover client server, what are these terms, what is client, what is a server, what is request and response, what are reserved sockets, what is internet addressing, and what is the role of IP address in that. We will cover about the TCP and UDP sockets, and all these rest of the topics we don't need to discuss today, because in today's lecture we will discuss about the basics of networking and how Java is responsible for having a secure and authentic networking between client and server. But this thing is pretty good. We can discuss in today's lecture that at the end of this unit, what we will learn. So at the end of this unit, first of all, we should be able to understand the communication protocols. Okay, we will see what are those communication protocols. Secondly, we will understand the socket creation, sending and receiving messages from client to server. Okay, then we will learn about UDP and TCP protocols. Okay, and by using UDP and TCP, how the client and server usually communicate with each other, and the usual client and server communication. Not only theoretically, we will definitely implement this in our lab as well. Okay, so those who are visiting college, they opted for offline classes. They would come, and we will discuss all these practicals in detail there as well. Okay, so let's start. First of all, we will see what is a client server communication. In simple terms, we can say there is a client and there is a server. So if we send a request to the server with some data or some parameter, the server would work on that request and respond back to the client. Okay, so it's a two-way communication. Client is sending a request and server is responding back. We are saying it is a data because server would receive it as a parameter or the input data, and client here would receive it as server data or server response. Okay, so we will definitely implement this architecture, client and server, over a machine as well. In lab we will cover this topic. Okay, let's move on to little more detail, in more detail, about what is client and server communication. Okay, so let's say we have a server called S1. Okay, and if you are not aware, in server we have different types of ports. Okay, so let's say we have a 8080 port, and we have all these ports in a server. So in our server we have 1000 ports. Okay, so what is the meaning of a port? For one web application, for one project, we use one port. Okay, let's say facebook.com resides on this port. The Google would reside on this port. So we are using different ports for different web applications, right? We have different clients, C1, C2 until C1000. And corresponding to these clients, we have their IP addresses, IP1, IP2 until IP1000. Okay, so these are the clients, okay, and these their IP addresses. But if we say this is a facebook.com, let's say facebook.com, okay, or facebook.com, actually a domain name, we will say Facebook, okay. We usually say it's a Facebook. Okay, so let me erase that. Okay, so Facebook web application this resides on 8080 port number. Okay, and not only one client would communicate with Facebook, right? So many clients can communicate with each other. So how is it possible? Is it possible because of multi-threading environment? Okay, so if there is a multi-threading environment created on this port of this application, then multiple clients can also connect with the same web application at the single port. Okay, So if you want to write something about it, then we would say a port of a server, this one 8080, can be used by many clients, like as you can see. Okay, and these are, six 5535. Okay, almost 65 or 66,000 clients can connect with the same web application at a single port. Okay, because of the multi-threading environment. So with the help of thread programming, or by having multiple threads for a single port of a server, it is possible to connect many clients with the same port of a server. Okay, so this is how the client and server communicate with each other. Okay, through ports, okay, and IP addresses. For a client, if the client doesn't have the IP address, it will not be able to connect with the server. They will see why. Because the IP address would be needed at server socket programming. Okay, so we will see what is the use of IP address of a client. Okay, what would be our development steps? So development steps would be, first we will develop an app, web application. Then we will convert that web application into exe file. Exe is executable file that can be run on a server. And later on, we will deploy or upload that exe file, okay, over the server. So for that application, let's say our application name is web app project. Okay, so on server, what file will be there? Web app project.exe. Okay, and for that we need to reserve a port of a server. Let's say we have reserved 8080 of a server port, right? So we need a port for that. So note, this is very important point. Okay, one port is usually reserved for one app deployment. Okay, you are not supposed to deploy more than one app on or at one port. One port should be used by one web application. Okay, because it will be easy for the domain server to figure out which server you are trying to invoke and at which port you are trying to invoke. Okay, because it's the DNS responsibility. We will explore what is DNS, domain name server, later on. But this thing must be clear that for the deployment, you need to reserve one port. Okay, let's come to this term, protocol, network, domain, and URL. Okay, generally over a client, we hit a URL. Okay, like as you can see here. So we usually hit a URL. Okay, we hit this URL using a browser at the client side, and this URL would perform some logic over server, and server will respond back to your request, and that response will be shown to you at the client browser. That is the process. Okay, so let's come to what are these things like protocol, network, and domain and URL we will use in this communication. Okay, if we hit this URL, we are aware that there is a URL, there is a request, there is a response, there is a server, there is a client. Okay, these terms we are clear. But what are these terms? Protocol, network, and domain name. So for to understand that, let's have a URL. Okay, I have taken the URL of Facebook. Okay, it is the standard URL of Facebook, in which there is a HTTPS protocol colon, and then we use / www.facebook.com. Okay, so in this URL, this is called URL. The whole thing is called URL, and this HTTPS is the protocol. Okay, and this www is the network, and facebook.com is the domain name. So uh, this is the syntax of protocol, network, and domain. But what are these things? What is protocol, what is network, and what is domain name? If this is the URL, this is fine. But what is protocol, what is network, and what is domain name? So protocol is, for example, here we have used a HTTPS protocol. It means it is a hypertext transfer protocol, which is based on TCP protocol. But what is the use of this protocol? We will see, don't worry. Network, there has to be an authentic network in which all the computers, all the servers, all the machines are connected. And in all those machines, this particular machine will be unique. this facebook.com, because after www, this is similar to a IP address of a server. Okay, so the domain is called, the correct IP address is used to figure out the correct IP address of a server to respond. Okay, I hope these terms are clear. We will discuss all these things in detail. So first we will discuss protocol in detail, then network, and then the domain name. Okay, let's explore what is a protocol. So when we talk about protocol, we generally think about HTTP, TCP, and IP. So IP is not a protocol, IP is the IP address. But to understand all these protocol and IP address, we need to address what is a network. Okay, so network, this thing, why this is called network? WW is a network. Okay, why it is not WWC or WW3, or why it is not called WWP? Why it is only WWW? That should be the question. Okay, so let's understand what is a network first of all. So we have 10 machines. Some of these are computers, some of these are servers, okay, and some of these are simple machines. All of these are machines. So we can say it is made out of server and computers or clients. Okay, so the computer we have named C1, C2 till C10, and their corresponding IP address I have provided. Okay, so all these computers are connected to each other somehow. Let's say if C1 wants to communicate with C9, then C1 would take this path, okay, and communicate with C9. It is not directly connected to C9, but it is somehow can communicate with C9. Okay, so that is the thing. So if C2 knows the IP address or the domain name of C9, it can connect with C9. Okay, because in this network, this domain name, the domain of name of C9 or the IP address of C9 would be unique. Okay, so we can connect through all these machines and servers. That is why it is called network. Okay, let's understand the role of HTTP, TCP, and IP. IP role we have understood. To figure out the uniqueness of individual machine and server, we use IP address. Then what is HTTP protocol and TCP protocol? So if we know the IP address or the domain name, okay, of this machine, then there has to be a path. Okay, why there has to be a path? Because we want that data to be secured, okay, and no other machine would be able to access that data. Only that if that data is meant to be received by C9, then there has to be a mechanism or the security mechanism that C2's that data will send to C9 will only be received by C9. Okay, so that will ensured by the TCP protocol. So TCP is a mechanism that allows us to transfer data safely. Then what is HTTP? If TCP is required to create a secure transmission, that is why it is called transmission control protocol. Then what is the use of HTTP? So HTTP stands for hypertext transfer protocol. It means whenever you try to send a hypermedia, okay, then that particular type of data will be sent to this particular IP address using that TCP protocol, because HTTP is built upon TCP protocol. Okay, so all these are connected. First, we need IP address of the machines. Then we need a secure, path to send the data over the network, and then we need a protocol which will carry the data in a particular format. In this case, the data would be in hypertext or hypermedia data will be sent from C2 to C9. That is the thing. Okay, so we are, we clear with what is HTTP, what is TCP, and what is IP address. Okay, let's understand the last term, which is domain. So we are clear with protocol, we are clear with what is a network, and let's understand what is a domain name, which is quite interesting to me. Okay, Let's understand domain. Okay, so let's say this is the domain name. That is what I have just mentioned over here. Okay, you don't need to be confused. uh, yeah. See, facebook.com is a domain name. So let's understand what it is. So we have a client, we have a Facebook server. Okay, what is this server? This is this C9. C9 in this network is the Facebook server. Okay, so among all these computers or the machines, this will be unique. And why it will be able to connect? Because C2 would have the domain name or the IP address of C9. Okay, so client would request or send a request to the Facebook server. Let's say you are trying to, let's talk about facebook.com. You're trying to click on the photos button on Facebook. Okay, you click on that and that request will be sent to Facebook server. It is so fast that you don't realize it, and the response of that will be shown to the client at that browser of client side. Okay, so in that, client sends a request and receives a response from the server. And in order to do that, the client knows that it is a facebook.com server. So the user doesn't need to remember the IP address of the server. Okay, in case if you want to remember the IP address of the server, and if you want to form a URL, then this is one of the IP addresses of facebook.com. So if you don't want to use DNS, then DNS is the domain name server. I'll tell you the use of DNS. But if you, instead of using the domain name, you want to use the IP address, then you can use directly the IP address of that server. But let's understand this 69.63.176.13.69, all these digits. It is very hard to remember by the end user. So what would you prefer, to remember this URL or this URL? Okay, so this URL definitely, because it is very easy to remember. So domain name server job is to map all those difficult IP address to a particular domain name. Okay, this is domain name, and this would be unique over this network. So even this facebook.com would be unique on this network. No other machine can acquire this name or have this name, right? And it is the job of DNS server to map it with the correct IP address. Let's understand through this network. Okay, so this is the network. So and C1 tries to communicate with C5. Okay, so C1 would send a data to C5 only if C1 is aware about the IP address of C5. Okay, otherwise the data will be spread across the network with each and every machine. Only if we have the IP address or the domain name, then the data will be secured. The TCP would take the responsibility of the data to be secured on that protocol. So when C1 sends a request to the C5, then C1 is only aware about the domain name, because I don't know the IP address. If I don't search it, I don't know the IP address of a server. So I only know this thing. Okay, plus www dot. So I know this thing. So C1 would hit this URL, right? Then that request will not be directed to C5. There is a middleware over this network that all the request would come to DNS server first of all, and DNS server will find the IP address of that particular domain name like we have used here, and it is the responsibility of the DNS server to direct the request to that particular machine over the network, because DNS would know the correct IP address of the machine according to the domain name you have sent. Okay, so you are sending first of all this URL. So when you hit this, https www.facebook.com. Okay, once you hit it, okay, or there is a button called, let's say, photos. So you are sending two things. First of all, you are hitting the URL, okay? And how you are hitting the URL? By clicking over this photos button. Okay, so this URL your browser would send to the DNS, and your action. Okay, your action means what will happen. Okay, this input will be sent as a request to the server, right? So as a request, you will have the URL, okay, or your login credentials, and your, the action, necessary action in the form of input as a request to the server. So that request first will be reached at DNS, okay, DNS server, and DNS would know, okay, why this URL you means this, and this will be then directed to that particular machine. Okay, so that is the use of DNS over the network. First of all the requests would come to DNS server to know the correct IP address of that particular domain name, and all the domain names over network, or all the IP addresses of the network or the network, would always be unique. Okay, so guys, this is about the basics of networking using Java. Okay, in the next lecture we will continue after that, but I think these are the all basic things you guys should always be aware about networking, and client server communication. These are the general things you should be aware. Probably in next lecture we will start with the this exploring java.net package and the sockets. Okay, so for today's lecture, thank you so much. Have a good day.